Hello, this is Minder Chen. I'm Professor of Management Information System at Smith School of Business Economics, CSU Channel Island. And this is our second lecture on business strategy. Last time we went over how strategy fit in the POLC framework, and we also explained strategy as a focus, discipline, and trade-off in making choices. At the same time, we started to introduce several model and framework for strategic development, including SWOT analysis and PASTEL in analyzing environmental factor affecting the formulation of our strategy, as well as the 5-force model, and based on the industry analysis. In this lecture, we're going to focus more on the internal analysis. However, this internal analysis in terms of the framework and model are relative term. Even in the internal analysis, you have to consider external factors to a certain extent. So in this lecture, we're going to discuss emerging strategy, value chain analysis, resource-based view, and VRIO, which is an acronym to describe certain attribute of your resource that will give you competitive advantage. And eventually, the so-called generic strategy. Both the 5-force model and generic strategy were proposed by Michael Porter, who is a professor at Harvard Business School. So let's look at the POLC framework a little bit again. We are here discussing the formulation and development of strategy, and which is part of the planning effort. Before we move on to discuss some of the internal framework in terms of analyzing and developing strategy, and let's introduce something called emergent strategy, and comparing to the so-called intended strategy, like the 5-force model. Basically, we put in the effort, we design a strategy and try to intend to implement it. However, based on a lot of real-world cases, Henry Mintzberg, a professor from a Canadian university, observed the phenomena that a lot of strategy being realized in companies tends to be so-called emergent strategy, which not came from the intended one, but somehow came from almost nowhere, which means sometimes they are the intended consequence of the intended strategy, or came from something else totally out of blue. And if you pursue some of the intended strategy, some of them may not work. So they're so-called non-realized strategy. About research shown that 10 to 30% that may have been eventually being implemented become the realized strategy. We will call those strategies so-called deliberate strategy. So a majority of this realized strategy tends to be coming from the so-called emergent strategy. Therefore, as a strategist, you actually have to, although you may start with the intended strategy, but you always need to pay attention to the response from the customer and also the environment, and then adapt your strategy based on the feedback you're getting from the customer environment. And in startup business, we usually refer that as a pivoting, which means you need to kind of pivot your strategy to something that may not be you have intended for. So this diagram showed the similar concept, which means you started with an intended strategy. A lot of them may not work. They become the so-called unrealized strategy, and you will continue working on a few of them that may still working. However, at the same time, some emerging strategies may emerge and become the realized strategy for a firm. So this is just the definition for this 5 type of so-called or categorization of business strategy. So once again, the emergent strategy is really not a framework. It's really an observation of certain pattern. So emergent strategy is about learning what works in practice and changing your strategy to meet those needs or unintended consequence. So emergent strategy is really a mentality, a mindset. It's setting out to build for instance, Nintendo was initially setting out to build a playing card company, but it ended up to be a very successful computer gaming firms or game machine company. Katie Hudson's started as a Christian musicians for Christian music. However, she actually pivoted eventually to a broader and mainstream market and became Katy Perry as we know it. PayPal initially was really tried to be used to actually bring money from Palm Pilot, which is kind of digital assistance device, and personal digital assistant, we call it PDA, a popular one, which you may not be familiar with it anymore. However, eventually it pivoted and became actually a very popular e-payment system on the web, in particular the early adoption by eBay, and eventually eBay actually acquired PayPal, made it actually very successful. Flickr was initially actually a multi-players online gaming software or website, but eventually it pivoted to a $40 million photo sharing site. So you can read some of the discussions and example of emergent strategy at this online resource. Next is value chain analysis. Value chain analysis by Michael Porter. He basically used value chain like this diagram to show a set of activity. Each building block is an activity. And he classified those activity into primary activity and then supporting activity. And the primary activity, to some extent, is there's a sequencing among them, which is you may be getting some raw material parts through inbound logistic, and then you operate on them, put it together, manufacturing the final product. And then through outbound logistic, you ship it to your customer. And on the customer end, you need to do marketing, sales, and provide after-sales service. So pretty much every firm needs to have this kind of primary activity, which is really focusing on producing the product and service and serving the customer through the product or services. And however, in order to perform those primary activity, we need HR support, technology support, and procurement. Procurement is particularly related to the inbound logistic and the operation. And additional firms' infrastructures, the building of office space, and some administrative support. So to kind of summarize what I just described, a value chain is really a set of activity that a firm performs by adding value. It's important. The key is the value and the value add, because you want to look at each of the activity and see how much value you add to the final product. And if certain activity listed in your value chain may not add that much value, you may want to consider outsource that activity. So you focus only on the one that you do really well, such as, for instance, Nike focus mainly on the marketing and sales of the Nike brand. They pretty much outsource most of the manufacturing to manufacturers in Vietnam, China, and other places. And eventually, certainly, you are still responsible to deliver the product and services for the market. And this value chain analysis came also from Michael Porter in his book published in 1985 called Competitive Advantage. And it describe the strategy for you to create and sustaining, in creating and sustaining superior performance. Another concept which is important in strategic planning is capability, and another one is core competence or core competencies. And capability is ability to bundle, manage, and apply resources. And it's important. Eventually, we will discuss another approach which focuses mainly on resources. But capability is about the ability to bundle, manage, and apply resources internally or externally in a way to achieve desired goals. And it's about what organization can do rather what they own. Which means you don't really need to own all the resources yourself. Xerox is a company which is very capable of inventing new technology. So they have great R&D capability, but they're very poor in its capabilities for delivering innovation to the marketplace, which means that Xerox is very weak in commercializing its R&D outcomes into commercially available products. For instance, laser printer was invented by Xerox as an example. Even the Apple's Macintosh, the operating system was, you can trace back its innovation back to Xerox PARC, Palo Research Center. We call it PARC. Next is core competence. Core competence is your ability to combine resource and capability that provide a competitive edge to a firms. And it is what you're best at. In this example, some consider TGI Fridays figure out that they're really good at selling and managing franchise. They're not really good in running restaurant itself. So selling and managing franchise is considered its core competence. Next is another framework. In management, by the way, we love to have framework or model to help us to think about some abstract concept. And so you, in this course, you really need to learn how to apply some of the framework in analyzing real cases. This is called resource-based view. It's called RBV. And in resource-based view, it helps us to focus on organization's strengths that is essential to achieving a sustained competitive advantage. Certainly, SWOT analysis help company to identify their strengths. RBB look for ways to use internal resources, which sometimes called assets, to take advantage of external opportunities. But personally, I do believe that you can actually tap into external resources provided by your strategic partner, such that you have more resources to pursue some of the external opportunity. So I would say, yes, you do need to have certain resource that you own internally, but you should not exclude external resources that you may gain access from external supplier or partner. And also be aware that resources can be classified into tangible and intangible resources. Intangible resource could be the capability of your human resources, and also some of the intellectual property that you own could be considered important resources. And this is an example of so-called resource view in understand management. And in this particular case, in understand how strategies is all about. Under resource-based view, it is important that the resource that we're talking about exhibit some attribute. This 4 attribute has an acronym called VRIO. VRIO stands for value, rarity, imitability, and the organization. We'll explain a little bit what each one of them mean, which means the resource has to be valuable. The resource is rare, that it's difficult for other people to obtain. Therefore, you do have some kind of strategic advantage. And the resource is not so easy for other people to copy. So it's inimitable. It is difficult to be imitated by other people. So this imitability in this case is not imitable. Not easy to imitable is important attribute, and has to be rare, valuable. An organization is really referred as the firms organized and ready and be able to exploit the resources with the capability they may have. So that's called VRIO. So remember what each of the acronyms mean. So basically, we're asking 4 questions kind of in sequence. Let me use this flow chart. Is the resource valuable? If it's not valuable, it really don't give you any advantages. Really end up to be a burden. So we may call it competitive disadvantage. Why you want to own those resource that's not valuable. Second is a rare. If it's not rare, we call it competitive parity, which means other people can gain the same resource and easily compete with you. And the third question is, if it's valuable and rare, but is it costly or takes a long time for people to imitate? If the answer is no, then the competitive advantage you're gaining tends to be temporary. So we call this temporary competitive advantage. And last not the least is to ask the question, is the firm organized to capture the value, to exploit the unique resource and capability they have? If the answer is no, it doesn't mean that you give up, which means that there is a so-called unexploited competitive advantage regarding this resource. And if you did have the organizational capability to capture and realize this resource in terms of its value, then and it's difficult to imitate, it's rare, so people cannot have access to it, and it's so valuable to you, then finally you're gaining the so-called sustained competitive advantage. So this is a resource-based view and also based on 4 attribute VRIO in assessing the resources and in classifying its competitive implications as listed in this matrix or table and also in this flowchart. They are basically identical. And another Michael Porter's, by this time you probably know Porter is considered a kind of guru in business strategy, a Harvard Business School professor. He introduced another simple framework, really, which is called generic strategies. It is called generic. Basically, there's 3 strategies. It's called generic because he believed this 3 strategy can apply to any industry, location, or any time. And the 3 generic strategies are the following: low cost or cost leadership strategy, differentiation, and focus. And in this case, for instance, if you focus on lower cost for broader market, it's considered a cost leadership. And if you offer lower cost with a very narrow market, it's called cost focus. Differentiation tends to relate it to product design or service rendering or service offering, which you try to differentiate from other existing player or competitor. And if you target broader market in terms of your competitive scope, we call this differentiation strategy. And if you combine both focus and differentiation, we call this focus differentiation. So once again, the 3 strategy, generic strategy, is cost leadership, differentiation, and focus. And focus, as you can tell, tends to be implied in terms of our competitive scope, tends to focus on a much narrowed marketplace, a market segment or customer segment. If you have a narrow customer and market segment as part of your strategy, then it's a focus strategy, and which can be combined with the cost leadership strategy or differentiate strategy, and which will become this 2 quadrant. If it's a broader scope in terms of the target, then it's cost leadership and differentiation. So here are a more detailed definition of this 4 classification, which we explain. But the example given here, cost leadership, Walmart come to our mind. Differentiation, Apple computers has its unique design and user friendliness in terms of its design. It's fashionable, but we really cannot say Apple's product is cheap. So it's really not competing in terms of lower, cheaper cost. And Nike is really target a much broader marketplace, and So it's kind of mass market. In terms of the narrow target, it's sometimes referred to as a niche market. For instance, Hoka 11, which is a brand named shoes, they're known for the shock absorbent running shoes. So they focus on really just the running shoes, very specific target market and product category. And focus certainly become a very important concept in business strategy, because if you remember, business strategy is all about making choices and trade-off. And focus as a part of your strategy thinking allow you to decide what not to do. It's very important you decide what not to do, and you're constantly making trade-off, and such that because you're not decided not to pursue a lot of other things that give you kind of a more focused energy and resources to pursue very few objectives. And this is a strategy which we can trace back to the Art of War again by Sun Tzu. And I call the strategy called divide and conquer. And it's also a focused strategy. And the whole point is to gain the relative superiority, which means a lot of time if you're small in size with limited resources, you can still compete, but you have to focus your energy in a very niche market that would give you enough resources to gain the relative superiority. If I make quotations here, say, by discovering the enemy's dispositions and remaining invisible ourselves, we can keep our force concentrated while the enemy must be divided, which means the enemy may focus on a much broader marketplace. So their energy has been, or resource has been spread too thin, and we can be more focused. So in a very niche area, we actually have more resources comparing to them. As a whole, we have less resources, but in the selected target market, we may have more resources and we are able to compete. Okay. So once again, focus in strategic development or strategy development is about gaining relative superiority, which is a very important concept. And this came from Sun Tzu's chapter 6. And by the way, the Art of War, I encourage you to read and get a copy of it. You can easily find some free copy online. This is actually ctext.org's version. And the translation tends to be more, it was done a long time ago, so the English may not be the so-called plain English by today's standard. The Porter suggests that firms should not try to combine the three generic strategy. And the firm who have tried often fail, but there are some organizations that has done it, have done it effectively. As example is Southwest Airlines that has combined cost-cutting measures, which give them the cost leadership with differentiation. And it provides the airline the possibility to succeed using this combination strategy. And the uniqueness of Southwest Airlines can be seen here in its mission statement. It's stated that Southwest Airlines dedicated to the highest quality of customer service, delivered with a sense of warmth, friendliness, individual pride, and company spirit. And you can find more information about Southwest mission and unique culture which is how they differentiate with other airlines other than the cost leadership. Okay, last, I want you to watch this 9 minutes video clip. It did relate strategy to military strategy, which is a little bit old-fashioned, but interesting comparison, which I like it. And when you watch it, it try to answer 4 questions that any strategy should answer. Is where do we compete, and what unique value do we bring, and what resource or capability do we utilize, and how do we sustain the unique value or sustain the competitive advantage. And in this video, starting around 5 minutes into the video, use IKEA as example. I would turn this into an assignment and ask you to answer this 4 questions using IKEA as a case. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Bye-bye.